Fujifilm is known for their high quality, affordable kit lenses, and in 2024 they might bring out the new king of kit lenses. So far, Fujifilm has two kit lenses in their X system lens lineup. Firstly, in 2012 they released the 18 to 55mm f2.8 to f4 variable aperture lens that was widely regarded as one of the best kit lenses that has ever been produced. And secondly, in 2019 they released the 16 to 80mm f4 lens, which was still praised because of its high build and image quality, but not to the same amount that the 18 to 55 has been. I have to say though, Fujifilm didn't release the 16 to 80 to replace the 18 to 55, but rather to have a more versatile option, with the downside of it being a little heavier and a little larger. But in 2024 Fujifilm is planning to change that with this new release that is planned to replace the 18 to 55 as the go-to kit lens. The reason why Fujifilm has been touted as the king of kit lenses, or rather the 18 to 55 specifically, because they offered an affordable, high-quality lens with, in comparison to other manufacturers, a rather low aperture. In the meanwhile, it seemed like other manufacturers kind of shrugged off the idea of a kit lens being high quality, and they kind of just used it to bring people to buy their camera bodies and offer the kit lens as like a cheap alternative to buying a high-quality lens. That way, most of the time, people are not really satisfied with the quality of the kit lens and kind of buy the expensive camera body with this kit lens. Oftentimes want to upgrade immediately after receiving this kit lens because its quality is not on par with the camera body. And that's actually a huge reason why people shoot Fujifilm, or at least in part, because they just went down a different road with this entire concept. So the 18 to 55 is actually being replaced, but what can Fujifilm really change about this lens to improve it? So as you probably already saw in the thumbnail of this video, this will be the 16 to 50mm f2.8 to f4.8 RLM-WR lens, which of course already gives us quite a lot of information. So let's start with the letters of this lens. The R stands for an aperture ring that will be on this lens. The 18 to 55 already had one, and this will be the same. It's still a variable aperture lens, which basically means that the aperture ring is still unmarked. The letters LM stand for linear motor, which basically just means there's like a snappy autofocus motor in the lens. I'm actually not sure, but I think could actually have been improved upon from the 18 to 55, so maybe this lens is actually snappier than the previous version. Then lastly, the WR means weather resistance. There are plenty of positive changes that this new lens will bring, unfortunately also a couple of negatives, but I wouldn't really see them as negatives, rather as a compromise that Fujifilm had to make. All of the top of the line X system cameras like the XH, XT and X Pro already have the weather sealing, and this new iteration of the 18 to 55 will finally bring this long awaited and very much needed change as well. A lot of people already use the 18 to 55 in rainy conditions, and apparently it's not too big of a deal, but it is very much comforting to know that this lens will actually have the seal of approval from the manufacturer that it can withstand those conditions. This next change is one I personally really love, and it's an improvement upon the weather sealing, I think. It's that this lens does not protrude anymore. This means this lens will actually stay in its small form factor, which is great for this stealthy kind of street photography where you don't want too much attention on yourself to be able to capture moments unfiltered. Having a zoom lens in such a small form factor that actually stays this way might even persuade people to sway away from their usually preferred prime lenses, if they can actually tolerate the high aperture, of course. A lot of people love the 18 to 55mm focal length range, but we're always longing for a bit more on the wide angle side. My personal experience with this is when I started out in photography, I started with a Nikon APS-C camera and I got myself an 18 to 55mm kit lens. And then when I switched over to the Fujifilm system, I actually bought the X-T4 with the 16 to 80mm lens. Having these 2mm of extra focal length actually makes a huge difference, I think, and it's actually way more than it sounds like. Here's the difference between an 18mm shot and a 16mm shot, and now comparing this gain to the loss on the telephoto side. So here's a comparison between a 55mm shot and a 50mm shot. Losing these 5mm on the telephoto side is still a noticeable difference, but I would argue gaining these 2mm on the wide angle side far outweighs the loss of this 5mm on the telephoto side. Especially because with a lot of these new Fujifilm X system cameras that have 40 megapixels, you can just crop in the last millimeters. As with the release of this lens in 2024, the 18 to 55mm will be a 12-year-old lens. And this likely means improvements in image quality due to things that Fujifilm has found in these last 12 years. Though don't expect to jump in image quality to the likes of the 16 to 55mm f2.8 red badge lens, as there still has to be a difference in quality, as otherwise Fujifilm could just stop producing and selling the 16 to 55mm. While keeping the same form factor as the 18 to 55mm lens, Fujifilm had to make some drawbacks on this lens, which may or may not impact your decision of buying this lens. Firstly, as the name of this lens already suggests, the aperture has been increased on the telephoto side from f4 to f4.8, which actually sounds like more than it actually is, as it's literally just half a stop of light. But it still might impact people that are buying this kit lens in conjunction with a camera body and are planning on shooting mostly portrait photography. Though to date we don't have any information on when aperture kicks in, meaning maybe the aperture is f2.8 from the wide angle side of 16 up until maybe 35mm, and then f4 from 35 to 45, and then for these last 5mm it's f4.8, but that's just something we don't have any information on yet. So for my photography, the aperture on this lens is really not a big deal, as I usually shoot above f4 anyway, and for most people that don't focus on portrait photography, this shouldn't be too big of a deal either, but of course people just like to shoot differently, so it might impact you. And the second downside to this lens is that they had to remove the OIS to keep the same form factor. Again, might not be a big deal to people that shoot with cameras that have IBIS anyway, but if you shoot with a mid-range X system camera like the XE line, you do not have IBIS in your camera, and this optical image stabilization on the lens can be a great benefit to you. So at that point you might want to consider either having the 18 to 55 or the 16 to 80mm lens, as both of these lenses have the optical image stabilization. Even though I have the Fujifilm X-T4, which actually does have IBIS, this loss of OIS kind of bugs me, as when shooting in low light this would actually be a welcome addition to this lens, especially because you're already losing half a stop of light because of this aperture increase. But I still think this lens will suit a lot of Fujifilm shooters, mostly street, travel and landscape photography, of course macro and portrait photography excluded. Anyway, I'll have to wait and see if this lens actually will bring image quality improvements to the 16 to 80mm lens that I currently own, but if it does, I actually might consider switching my 16 to 80mm lens to the 16 to 50mm lens just for its travel photography capacities. As we are already at the end of this video, you're probably a Fujifilm enthusiast and might want to know what other lenses Fujifilm will release in 2024, so check out this video right here.